Hi, I'm Hallie, and what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core because it's a story about betrayal, abandonment, and the most unlikely salvation that changed everything. This isn't just another sob story. This is about discovering that sometimes the person who saves your life is the one everyone else forgot existed. But before I tell you how an 82-year-old man with grease-stained hands rebuilt my shattered soul, let me paint you the picture of how my world exploded into a million pieces on one suffocating August morning in 2008. I was 12 years old, sitting in the back seat of our beat-up Honda Civic, watching endless cornfields blur past like golden prison bars. The air conditioning had died somewhere outside Akron, and the vinyl seats were sticking to my legs through my denim shorts. My mother, Sarah, kept fidgeting with the radio, searching for a station that wouldn't fade in and out. Her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously against the plastic dial. That's when she turned around with this smile. God, that smile still haunts me. It was the kind of smile people wear to cancer patients when they're about to deliver devastating news. "Sweetie," she said, her voice artificially bright like artificial sweetener. "You're going to have such an amazing summer with Grandpa Joe. 3 months max, I promise. Just until Daddy and I figure some things out with the business." 3 months. That's what she said. But you know what? Even at 12, I could read the lies written in the tight lines around her eyes, in the way her voice cracked just slightly on the word promise. My father, Michael, hadn't spoken a single word to me since we'd loaded my duffel bag into the trunk that morning. His hands were gripped so tight on the steering wheel that his knuckles had gone bone white. His jaw clenched like he was trying to physically hold back words that would destroy whatever was left of our family. The only sound he'd made was clearing his throat when Sarah asked if he wanted to stop for gas. You want to know what 3 months really meant in parent speak? It meant forever. It meant we're done pretending you fit into our lives. It meant we're cutting you loose because it's easier than dealing with whatever mess we've made of our marriage. But here's the thing. I didn't know any of this consciously. All I knew was that my stomach felt like it was full of broken glass. And every mile we drove deeper into rural Pennsylvania felt like we were traveling further away from everything I'd ever known. The farm appeared like something torn from a Depression-era photograph. Weathered gray siding that hadn't seen paint since the Carter administration. A tin roof spotted with rust stains that looked like dried blood. And a wraparound porch that sagged on the right side, like it was too tired to hold everything together anymore. Ancient oak trees surrounded the property like sentinels, their branches heavy with summer leaves that whispered secrets I couldn't understand. This was my grandfather, Joe Henderson's place, tucked away in hills that rolled like sleeping giants toward the horizon. I'd only met him twice in my entire life. Once at my grandmother's funeral when I was 7 and cried because I didn't understand why everyone was dressed in black. And once at a disastrous family barbecue where he had sat in a folding chair by himself, nursing a beer and watching everyone else with eyes that seemed to see too much. He was this quiet, weathered man who wore red flannel shirts in every season and had hands that looked like they'd rebuilt the entire world piece by piece. The few times he'd spoken to me, his voice was gravelly from years of not using it much, but there was something solid about him, like he was rooted deeper than those ancient oaks surrounding his property. When our car's engine finally wheezed to a stop in his gravel driveway, the silence was absolutely deafening. No crickets chirping, no birds singing, just the sound of settling gravel and my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Grandpa Joe emerged from the farmhouse screen door like he'd been watching from the kitchen window, which maybe he had. He was smaller than I remembered, maybe 5'8" with shoulders that had once been broad, but were now slightly stooped from decades of bending over engines and workbenches. But there was something unshakable about his presence, like he was anchored to this land by invisible steel cables. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned that words were tools to be used sparingly and with precision. "Guess you'd better come inside before the mosquitoes eat you alive." That was it. No fake enthusiasm about how fun this was going to be. No false promises about adventures we'd have together. Just practical acceptance laced with the kind of dry humor that comes from surviving 8 decades of life's curveballs. My mother gave me one of those butterfly kisses on the top of my head. You know the kind, where her lips barely grazed my hair like she was afraid that committing to a real kiss might make her change her mind about leaving me here. Her perfume smelled like lilacs and lies. My father managed a backwards wave without turning around, like even looking at me might crack whatever resolve he'd built up for this moment. Through the rear window, I watched him light a cigarette with shaking hands, the first time I'd ever seen my father smoke. I stood there in that gravel driveway with my duffel bag cutting into my shoulder, watching their Honda disappear down that dirt road like a mirage evaporating in desert heat. The dust cloud they kicked up hung in the air for what felt like hours, and I kept expecting, no, praying, that they'd realize they'd made a terrible mistake, that they'd slam on the brakes at the first crossroads, throw the car in reverse, and come racing back for me with apologies spilling from their lips. They never did. The sound of their engine faded until even the memory of it disappeared, leaving me standing in a silence so complete it felt like the world had been wrapped in cotton. That's when Grandpa Joe's voice cut through my paralysis. "Mosquitoes don't care if you're having a moment," he said, not unkindly. "Come on." That first night, I lay in what had been my father's childhood bedroom, staring at wallpaper covered in faded baseball players from the 1960s. Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, players whose names I recognized from my dad's occasional nostalgic ramblings about the golden age of baseball. The single bed creaked like an old ship every time I shifted position, and the whole house seemed to breathe around me, settling, sighing, adjusting to accommodate this unwanted stranger who'd been dumped on its doorstep. But here's what got me. When I'd climbed those narrow stairs earlier, I'd found that someone, and it could only have been Grandpa Joe, had left a glass of ice water and a small, clean towel folded precisely on the nightstand. Nothing fancy, no welcome basket or stuffed animals, just practical kindness that spoke louder than any grand gesture could have. I held onto that towel like it was a lifeline, because it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, someone in this world had thought about what I might need before I even knew I needed it. But here's what really shattered me. I could hear him downstairs, moving around the kitchen with quiet, purposeful efficiency, not tiptoeing like he was afraid to disturb the traumatized kid upstairs, not making extra noise to reassure me he was there, just existing with the same steady rhythm I'd hear every morning for the next 6 years. The sound of normalcy in a world that had just exploded. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes and something I couldn't identify at first, the scent of a house where someone actually lived instead of just existing. Coffee percolating in an old aluminum pot. Bacon sizzling in a cast iron skillet. The quiet symphony of dishes being arranged with the precision of a morning ritual perfected over decades. When I finally worked up the courage to venture downstairs, I found Grandpa Joe standing at a 1950s gas stove that looked like it belonged in a museum, flipping pancakes with the focused concentration of a surgeon performing heart surgery. He wore the same red flannel shirt from yesterday, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were road maps of scars, burns, and calluses. The hands of a man who'd spent his life making broken things whole again. He didn't ask if I'd slept well, probably because the dark circles under my eyes made that question redundant. He didn't try to fill the silence with false cheer or awkward small talk about my feelings. He just pointed to a plate stacked high with pancakes. Some golden brown and perfect, others burnt around the edges like charcoal halos, and said one word, eat. I always took the burnt ones. Always. I don't know why. Maybe because they reminded me that even when things don't turn out perfect, they can still nourish you. Maybe because I felt like damaged goods deserved damaged food. Or maybe because taking the burnt ones meant leaving the perfect ones for him. And that felt like the only way I could say thank you for not making me feel like a burden. He never asked why I chose them, and I never explained. Some understanding doesn't need words. Grandpa Joe had routines carved in granite. Up every morning at 5:30, regardless of season. Coffee so strong it could wake the dead brood in that ancient aluminum percolator. Toast that was always slightly more burnt than it should be because he'd get distracted reading yesterday's newspaper while it cooked. He'd stand at the kitchen sink while I ate, sipping from a chipped ceramic mug that read, Henderson Construction, 1982, in faded red letters, staring out at fields that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Like we both understood that words could be weapons, and we'd both been hurt enough by other people's careless ammunition. During those first endless days, I wandered his property like a ghost, haunting familiar territory. The farm had secrets tucked into every corner, a red barn with hay bales stacked like giant building blocks. A chicken coop where Rhode Island Reds eyed me with suspicious intelligence. Vegetable gardens laid out with military precision, and acres of pasture land that seemed to roll on forever under skies so big they made me feel like an ant. But it was the workshop behind the barn that captured my attention like a moth drawn to flame. This wasn't just a tool shed. This was a cathedral of forgotten dreams and patient craftsmanship. Every square inch of wall space was covered with tools I couldn't name. Socket wrenches arranged by size like a metallic rainbow. Drill bits organized in wooden blocks with holes bored to precise specifications. Hand planes that looked like they had been crafted by artisans who understood that tools were extensions of the human soul. Half-finished projects covered every available surface, a rocking chair with one arm attached, a radio cabinet missing its front panel, an engine block torn down to its component parts, and laid out like a mechanical autopsy. The air was thick with the holy scent of motor oil, sawdust, and WD-40, underlaid with something indefinable that I later learned was the smell of patience itself. Grandpa Joe spent hours in that workshop, sleeves rolled up to reveal those scarred forearms that told stories I was only beginning to guess at. An old Philco transistor radio sat on the main workbench, crackling out Indians baseball games and golden oldies through static that somehow made everything sound more authentic. more real than the crystal clear digital audio I was used to. He moved through that space with the fluid precision of a master craftsman, every gesture economical and purposeful. No wasted motion, no frustrated sighs when something didn't fit right the first time. Just the steady, methodical approach of someone who'd learned that rushing only created more problems to solve. One sweltering afternoon in my second week there, I lingered too long in the workshop doorway, watching him work on what looked like the engine from a 1970s lawn tractor. The thing was completely disassembled, its parts spread across the workbench like organs waiting for resurrection. He was cleaning each piece with surgical precision, using a wire brush to remove decades of accumulated grime and corrosion. He glanced up, caught me staring, and held up a 3/8-inch socket wrench like it was a magic wand. "Want to try?" he asked, his voice carrying no expectation either way. I couldn't answer. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of gravel. But something in his patient expression made me step forward into that sacred space, crossing an invisible threshold that would change everything. He showed me how to position the wrench on the cylinder head bolts, how to apply steady pressure counterclockwise to loosen them without stripping the threads. "Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty," he said with the ghost of a smile. Simplest rule in mechanics. But half the world forgets it when they're frustrated. My 12-year-old hands were too small, too weak, too inexperienced. I dropped the wrench twice, metal clanging against concrete in a way that made me flinch and mumble apologies. But Grandpa Joe didn't sigh or shake his head or take over like every other adult in my life would have. He just waited, patient as stone, while I fumbled my way toward competence. When that first bolt finally gave way, when I felt it surrender under my hands after what seemed like hours of struggle, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just mechanical, it was metaphysical. For the first time in weeks, I'd made something happen through my own effort. Grandpa Joe smiled then, just once, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was the kind of smile that felt earned rather than given, valued rather than expected. We didn't talk about it afterward. He just handed me a shop rag to wipe the grease from my fingers. Good, honest grease that smelled like progress, and went back to work on the next bolt. But something fundamental had shifted between us. Some invisible barrier had crumbled. That night at dinner, canned tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches that were perfectly golden on one side and slightly charred on the other because he'd been listening to a Cubs game on the radio while cooking. I found myself really studying him for the first time. He ate with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. No wasted motions, no hurried bites. The kitchen radio played softly in the background, some melancholy country song about heartbreak and redemption that seemed to capture exactly how I felt inside. "Grandpa Joe?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his soup, waited with that infinite patience that was becoming familiar. "Are they coming back?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from his evening pipe. For a long moment, the only sound was Hank Williams Jr. on the radio and the distant hum of the ancient Frigidaire in the corner. Then he set down his spoon and really looked at me. Not through me or around me the way adults usually did, but directly at me like I was a person worth seeing. "I don't know, kiddo," he said finally, his voice gentle but honest. "But you're here now. That's what matters." It wasn't the answer I wanted. I wanted promises, guarantees, fairy tale endings, but it was truthful. And somehow, that honesty was more comforting than any false promise would have been. As the days turned into weeks, I began to understand that Grandpa Joe wasn't trying to replace my parents or fix what they'd broken in me. He was just offering me space to exist without explanation or apology. In his workshop, I learned that broken things could be made whole again with patience and the right tools. In his kitchen, I learned that burnt edges didn't make food inedible. In his quiet presence, I learned that love didn't always announce itself with grand gestures or flowery words. Sometimes love sounded like a socket wrench, turning in steady hands. Teaching a lost girl that she was worth the time it took to show her something beautiful. 3 months came and went like seasons changing. No phone calls, no letters, no surprise visits. Just the gradual understanding that this was my life now. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a kid who'd been thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. Because here's what I discovered in those quiet months before everything changed. Sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones who brought you into the world. Sometimes they're the ones who simply show up when everyone else walks away. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of burnt pancakes and patient hands, teaching you that broken things deserve to be fixed rather than discarded. But this is just the beginning of my story, because what I didn't know then, sitting in that workshop, watching Grandpa Joe rebuild engines and accidentally rebuilding my faith in human decency, was that he was preparing me for something extraordinary. The skills he was teaching me, patience, precision, the unshakable belief that broken things could be made beautiful again, would become the foundation for a discovery that would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of kids just like me. Kids who had been thrown away. Kids who'd been forgotten. Kids who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. The real question wasn't whether my parents would come back. The real question was, who was I becoming in their absence? And could this abandoned, angry, heartbroken girl learn to build something meaningful from the scattered pieces of her childhood? Stay with me, because this story is about to take a turn that will blow your mind. And trust me, when I tell you that some of the most beautiful things in this world are built from the pieces other people thought were too broken to save. You know what they say about time healing all wounds? That's complete garbage. Time doesn't heal anything. It just teaches you how to carry the pain differently. But what I discovered in my second year with Grandpa Joe was something that would make that pain into my greatest strength. It was October 2009, and the Pennsylvania hills had exploded into a riot of reds and golds that took my breath away every single morning. I was 13 now, taller, stronger, and carrying myself with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing someone believes in you unconditionally. The workshop had become my sanctuary, my church, my university, all rolled into one grease-stained cathedral. But here's where this story takes a turn that will absolutely blow your mind. I was elbow deep in rebuilding a 1978 Yamaha motorcycle engine that Grandpa Joe had somehow acquired from a neighbor's barn sale when I stumbled across something that would change the trajectory of my entire life. The bike had been sitting in that barn for over 20 years. A victim of neglect and teenage stupidity. The original owner had apparently tried to upgrade it with aftermarket parts that had no business being anywhere near a precision machine. "This poor thing has been butchered," Grandpa Joe said, running his weathered hands over the mangled carburetor. Look here, they tried to force a Kawasaki intake manifold onto a Yamaha head. That's like trying to transplant a horse's heart into a greyhound. I was learning that everything in mechanics was about compatibility, precision, and respect for the original design. But more than that, I was learning that broken things deserved patience, not abandonment. We'd been working on that Yamaha for 3 weeks when I discovered the hidden compartment. I was removing the seat to access the rear shock mounts when my screwdriver slipped and punched through what I thought was solid fiberglass. Instead, it revealed a hollow space that had been concealed beneath the seat pan. My heart started racing, not because I thought we'd found buried treasure, but because the engineering genius of this hidden compartment was absolutely beautiful. "Grandpa Joe," I called, my voice tight with excitement, "you need to see this." He ambled over, wiping his hands on a shop rag, and peered into the cavity I'd accidentally discovered. Inside was a leather portfolio, wrapped in what looked like multiple layers of plastic bags. It had been perfectly preserved, protected from moisture and time by whoever had hidden it there. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, carefully extracting the package. "Looks like this bike had secrets." The portfolio belonged to someone named Marcus Chen, according to the engineering ID badge tucked into the front pocket. But it wasn't the name that made my hand shake as I opened it. It was the contents, blueprints, dozens of them, dozens. Hand-drawn technical diagrams that were so precisely detailed, they looked like they'd been drafted by a master architect. But these weren't plans for buildings or bridges. These were designs for prosthetic limbs, mobility devices, and adaptive technologies that were decades ahead of anything I'd ever seen. One diagram in particular caught my attention, a prosthetic leg design that incorporated shock absorption, natural gait mechanics, and what looked like a self-adjusting weight distribution system. The notes were written in a mixture of English and what I later learned was Mandarin. But the universal language of engineering spoke clearly enough. This person was a genius, I whispered, tracing the elegant lines with my finger. Grandpa Joe studied the papers over my shoulder, his breath whistling softly through his teeth. "Marcus Chen," he read aloud, "MIT graduate student, class of 1979, biomechanical engineering." But here's where it gets really incredible. Tucked behind the technical drawings was a personal letter, written in the same precise handwriting as the engineering notes. It was dated September 15th, 1979, and it began, "To whoever finds this, if something happens to me, please make sure these designs reach people who need them. I've spent 4 years developing adaptive technologies for wounded veterans. But the medical establishment isn't ready for innovation this radical. They want incremental improvements, not revolutionary change." The letter went on to explain that Marcus had been working with the underground network of veterans and engineers, developing prosthetics and mobility aids that were being rejected by traditional medical device companies. "Too expensive," they said. "Too complicated. Too different from the accepted standards." But Marcus had seen something that the corporate executives couldn't, that disabled bodies weren't broken machines needing simple fixes, but complex systems requiring elegant, personalized solutions. "I've hidden copies of my work in 12 different locations." The letter continued, "If the establishment won't manufacture these designs, maybe someday someone else will have the courage to try." I looked up at Grandpa Joe, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "This is incredible. These designs are revolutionary," he finished quietly, "and decades ahead of their time. That night, I spread the blueprints across the kitchen table like sacred texts, studying every line, every measurement, every innovative detail. Grandpa Joe made his usual burnt-edge grilled cheese sandwiches and sat across from me, watching me work with that patient expression I'd come to treasure. "What are you thinking, kiddo?" he asked finally. I looked up from a diagram showing a wheelchair design that could transform into a standing frame with the push of a button. I'm thinking about all the people who could have been helped by these designs. All the veterans who've been struggling with equipment that was designed in the 1950s because nobody wants to take risks. And I'm thinking that maybe we could build one, just to see if it works. Grandpa Joe was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and studying my face. Finally, he smiled, that rare, earned smile that had become my most treasured reward. "All right," he said, "but we do this right. We study every detail, source the proper materials, and we don't cut corners. If we're going to honor this man's work, we do it with the respect it deserves." That's how my real education began. For the next 8 months, our workshop transformed into something that would have made MIT's engineering department jealous. Grandpa Joe somehow managed to acquire materials that should have been way beyond our budget. Aerospace-grade aluminum, precision bearings, hydraulic components that belonged in fighter jets, not farm workshops. I never asked where he got the money. I was starting to suspect that my grandfather's past was more complex than his quiet demeanor suggested. We started with Marcus Chen's simplest design, a prosthetic hand that used a cable and pulley system activated by shoulder movement. The original blueprints were brilliant, but they were also 40 years old. I began making small modifications, updating the designs with modern materials and techniques I'd researched online. "What you're doing," Grandpa Joe said one evening as I fine-tuned the finger articulation mechanism, "is what Marcus would have wanted. You're not just copying his work, you're evolving it." The first prototype took 6 months to complete. It was crude, ugly, and made sounds like a rusty gate when it moved. But when I demonstrated the grip strength by crushing an empty soda can, something magical happened in that workshop. We both realized we were holding something that could change lives. "We need to test it properly," I said, my voice barely steady. "We need to find someone who actually needs this." That's when Grandpa Joe told me about Tommy Reeves. Tommy was a 28-year-old Iraq war veteran who'd lost his right hand to an IED in Fallujah. He lived about 30 miles away, struggling to adapt to prosthetics that were functional but primitive. Glorified hooks that made him feel more disabled than empowered. "Tommy comes to the VA clinic in Greensburg every month," Grandpa Joe explained. "I met him at the diner there when I was picking up parts. Good kid. Deserve better than what he's dealing with." "You think he'd be willing to try our prototype?" "I think he'd be willing to try anything that might give him back some of what he lost." The day we met Tommy Reeves was the day everything changed for me. He was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'7" with sandy brown hair and eyes that carried too much knowledge for someone still in his 20s. His current prosthetic was exactly what I'd imagined. A basic myoelectric device that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie from 1975. When Grandpa Joe explained what we'd been working on, Tommy's expression shifted from polite skepticism to genuine interest. "You're telling me a 13-year-old girl built this?" he asked, examining our prototype with the careful attention of someone who understood engineering. 14 now, I corrected, and I had help from someone who knows what he's doing. Tommy spent an hour asking technical questions that pushed my understanding to its limits. How did the grip strength compare to natural hand function? What was the battery life? Could the sensitivity be adjusted for different tasks? But the real test came when he actually tried it on. I'd spent weeks perfecting the socket interface, using soft materials and custom padding to make it as comfortable as possible. When Tommy slipped his residual limb into the prototype and activated the control system for the first time, his entire face transformed. The prosthetic hand closed around a coffee cup with natural, fluid motion. Tommy lifted it, brought it to his lips, took a sip, and set it down without spilling a drop or crushing the ceramic. Then he started to cry. "I haven't been able to drink coffee normally in 3 years," he whispered. "The VA prosthetic is either too weak to grip the cup or too strong and it shatters." But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything came when Tommy picked up a pencil and wrote his name on a piece of paper. His handwriting was shaky, unpracticed, but legible. "How is this possible?" he asked, staring at his signature like it was a miracle. "Proportional control," I explained, my voice thick with emotion. "The harder you flex your shoulder muscles, the stronger the grip. But it's also got pressure sensors that prevent it from applying too much force to delicate objects." Tommy looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not gratitude, but recognition. Like he was seeing me as an equal. A fellow engineer who'd solved a problem that had been making his life hell. "Kid," he said, "you've got a gift. And I don't just mean for engineering." That night, Grandpa Joe and I sat on the front porch watching fireflies dance in the pasture. I was still buzzing with excitement from Tommy's reaction, but there was something deeper happening inside me, a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. "You know what this means, don't you?" Grandpa Joe said quietly. "That we built something that works? No, that you found what you're supposed to do with your life." I thought about that for a long time, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. "Marcus Chen's letter," I said finally. "He talked about an underground network, people working outside the traditional system to help others. And I want to find them. I want to know what happened to Marcus. And I want to continue his work." Grandpa Joe smiled, that rare expression that made everything feel possible. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Why?" "Because I think it's time you learn the truth about why your parents really left you here." The way he said it made my blood turn to ice water. "What do you mean?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with secrets he'd been carrying for too long. "Your father didn't just work in sales. Hallie, he worked for a medical device company called Meridian Technologies. And 3 years ago, he discovered something about their prosthetics division that he wasn't supposed to know." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What kind of something?" "The kind that gets people fired, blacklisted, and sometimes worse. Your father found evidence that Meridian was deliberately suppressing advanced prosthetic designs to protect their profit margins. Designs very similar to what we just built." I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole into a world I never knew existed. "That's why they left me here. Because Dad was in trouble?" "They left you here because they thought it would keep you safe. Meridian has a long reach, and they don't like people who threaten their monopoly. But now you've just proven that a 14-year-old girl with the right knowledge and tools can build prosthetics that are decades ahead of what they're selling." How do you think they'd feel about that? The implications hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just building better prosthetics. We were threatening a multi-billion-dollar industry that had built its fortune on keeping people dependent on inferior technology. But here's the thing about being abandoned and rebuilt from scratch. You learn that safety is an illusion, and the only real security comes from being too valuable to destroy. "Let them come," I said, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. "We have something they don't." "What's that?" "We have the truth, and we have people like Tommy who deserve better than what they're getting." That night marked the end of my childhood and the beginning of something much more dangerous and infinitely more important. Because I discovered that my abandonment wasn't random. It was part of a larger story involving corporate corruption, suppressed innovation, and the countless veterans and disabled people who were being failed by a system that valued profits over human dignity. But I'd also discovered something else, that broken things, whether they're engines, prosthetics, or 13-year-old girls, could be rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful than they'd ever been before. The question was, were we ready for the fight that was coming? Because trust me, after what happened next, fighting was exactly what we'd have to do.